Welcome to our second week talking about the kleshas. So the kleshas are obstacles to happiness or causes of suffering. And the second of our kleshas is this concept asmita. Asmita means identification with the ego. It's this sense of I-ness, and it is identifying things that are not the true self and being mistaken, taking them as your true self. So if you think back to the last of the kleshas, when we talked about avidya, it was this ignorance where we basically get confused about what's real and what isn't real. And when it comes to the self, this is something that can be really strong. I mean, the ego has a reputation of having a very tight grip on us. And the reality of this is that we need a certain level of ego to function in the world. It gives us motivation, it gives us drive, but we don't want to get to the point where our ego is like a bully. We're being pushed around by what the ego is telling us or the judgments that our ego is making. The process of working through asmita is identifying the ego, identifying the patterns that your ego has, identifying when it's bubbling up and causing you suffering, so that when you identify those things, you'll know that you need to work through them. And our yoga practice gives us tools to be able to work through that. And when you do identify those thought patterns, if you need to shift them, change them, and create new ones, you'll have the tools to be able to do that. So what are the things that we identify incorrectly as the self? It's really a lot of different things in your life. It's your job, it's your car, it's the house that you live in. It is really the physical things that make up your life that a lot of people tend to feel like gives them self-worth. If you have a nice car, if you have a big house, that it means that you're a better person. Not really. But that's kind of the overwhelming theme in the society that we live in. That if you have things that show wealth, that you're a worthy person. And this causes suffering because that's our external world. And in yoga, we know that those are all things that are going to change, right? Everything is changing, including our external environment, our possessions, our financial situation. All of those things are in constant flux. And when we identify with those things, they're always going to be pulled away and changed. So that causes suffering. When we identify with the true self or the soul or the core of our being, that's the only thing that's unchanging and constant. So that's where we find stability. The other part of this that really causes a lot of people suffering is identification with the body. This is a hard one because we're all constantly going through the aging process, and that's that constant pattern of change. Our body is always changing. It's responding to the demands that you put on it or the lack of demands that are on it. It's responding to the stress that you're experiencing, the level of exercise that you're doing, the movements that you do habitually, and the posture that you hold habitually are all shaping your body. And the aging process, of course, we do a lot of things to try to slow it down. Even in yoga, we try to maintain the best health possible so that we're as useful as possible, that we're able to provide as much service as we can during this lifetime. That's really the goal. But the external appearance we get really attached to. And a lot of times we're kind of happy with a younger version of ourselves, and it causes us suffering because we can't stay in that place for any amount of time, really. So it's this constant process of understanding that the physical body is going through change and that that is an external layer, that that's not the true self, that anything that changes or shifts is not that point of stillness that dwells internally. That's a tricky one. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of yoga practice to recognize when the suffering comes up with that. But one part that you're going to start to notice, and this can be tricky too as you get older, your practice is going to change. I know my practice from when I was 18 and I first started practicing, and I was an athlete at that time, my practice was very different. My early 20s, I had a really strong vinyasa practice, lots of arm balances, things like that. And then as I got toward my later 20s and things started to happen and my body wasn't quite as strong as it was when I was younger, my practice had to change accordingly. And now in my 30s, it's definitely a very different landscape of what I do on my mat than when I was 18 when I started. And part of that is the process that my body has gone through during that period, and part of it is what I've learned about the yoga practice. So it's just watching that evolution, because things are always going to change. The labels and the roles that we hold, we take a lot of pride in those things, especially if it's something that you've worked hard for. That's something that the ego holds up and says, look what I did, look how hard I worked, look what I accomplished. And we use that as a way to make ourselves feel like we're worthy, like we accomplished something. We already talked about possessions, achievements, kind of along the same thing, along the line of roles. But think about family roles as well. If you hold the title of mother or father, a sibling, an aunt and uncle, all of those kind of roles, those are other labels that you put on yourself. All of those labels are things that the ego uses to create these judgments. We have sort of this idea of what a mother is. And suffering will start to come in when you don't feel like you fit into that mold of being the mother or being the sister or whatever it might be. When you don't feel like you fit into that ideal category, that might start to cause you some suffering. But we know that every situation is a little bit different. There is no one size fits all definition of a role. So just trying to keep that in mind. But going deeper into the internal aspect of Asmita, the relationship with yourself, which is the most important relationship that you have. The relationship that you have with yourself is going to dictate how you interact with everything and everyone around you. It's going to determine what you do during your day. It's going to determine how you speak to other people, the things that you choose to do, the goals that you have. This is the core of everything that's unfolding in your life, that relationship with yourself. And if you have a relationship with this false self, there's going to be a lot of turmoil and suffering and difficulty, like the Kleshas tell us. If you have a good relationship with the capital S self, the deep internal self, then you're probably going to not be so flustered when these things change, but you're going to make choices that are healthier, that take better care of yourself. Say you identify really strongly with your possessions and that gives you self-worth. You might end up being a workaholic who has to constantly earn money to get this giant house at the cost of sacrificing your health and making yourself sick because you're working so hard and not eating well or exercising. If you were coming more from this place of having a relationship with the core self, it becomes easier to find balance in your life. You don't feel as driven by the judgments of the ego telling you that you are not enough, or that you need to work harder, or that you're not worthy of something. It's shifting to a space of having unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional self-love, that no matter if you lose your job or if you lose a relationship or any of the kind of things that come and go in our life, none of those things make you less of a person. So it's a connection to the internal steadiness and knowing that these aspects of the false self can't change or taint that in any way. So that brings us to this idea of awareness and balance, because you can take this to an extreme end. If my possessions don't matter, if my achievements don't matter, if my financial situation doesn't matter, then I can go down and sit on the beach in Mexico all day and not do anything. But the reality is that I need to have food and shelter and all of those things that I need to survive. So I have to be able to put myself into the world and go to work and be able to pay my bills and support myself. So the ego has to say that there's a balance between overemphasizing your possessions and your achievements, but knowing that you have enough qualifications to fill a certain role, that you can apply for a job, that you have the confidence to do that, because the ego is going to let you have that confidence to stand up in front of a room of people and convey information that might be helpful. Where if the ego was telling you that you're not good enough, you're not worthy enough, then you would avoid that situation altogether. So there has to be this balance of the ego's function. And like I said, it can go both ways. Of course, we know people who maybe have really low self-esteem or very harsh on themselves, even though they probably shouldn't be if, they have a lot of things going for them, but maybe they don't necessarily recognize it because the ego is really, really harsh. And then it can go the other way too, where the ego of somebody is really, really strong and it builds them up and it tells them that they are the best at everything, where maybe they're not as experienced as they need to be at certain things, or they need to step back and be more teachable. They need to be somebody who is trying to learn rather than feel like they've mastered everything. There's a middle ground there. And that's the place that you want to be in, ideally to function in the normal world if you are a householder and you have to do things. The quote that I put over on the side I think is so interesting. It says, "Yoga is the martial art of the soul, and your opponent is the ego." The tools that we learn through yoga, practicing asana, is going to help us to have a healthy relationship with our physical body. Practicing meditation is going to help to calm and guide the mind into the patterns that are helpful and useful for us. And through those systems, the ego is going to become balanced. We're going to have that appropriate ego response when things happen. So when you're practicing, you're watching for when the ego comes up. And specifically in your yoga practice, we've all had this experience. So there's a certain pose for all of us that you really don't like. And you go into that pose and you can't do it. Maybe it's a balance pose and you always fall out of it and it's hard and you're shaking. And you have this thought when you're in that pose of, I am bad at yoga. I can't do this. This pose is awful. I don't even know why I'm doing yoga. So then maybe a little bit later in the same practice, there's another pose that you feel like you're really good at, and you're doing that pose and you're holding it and you're like, man, I am awesome at yoga. Look how good I am. This feels so good. So the reality is that you can't be good or bad at yoga. It's just an experience. It's something that we practice, and it's going to be different for everybody who does it. You can't be bad at yoga. I always tell people that. But the ego is going to pass judgment on what your pose looks like, especially if there's somebody next to you who's more experienced or more flexible, and you're looking over at them and you're thinking, well, why doesn't my pose look like that? The thing you have to keep in mind is everybody's background is different. They might have been a dancer for 10 years before they came to yoga, which is the situation very frequently. A lot of dancers and people who come from movement systems end up in yoga when they get older. And the physical postures are just easier for them. So it doesn't mean that they're better at yoga than you are. It just means that their physical layer is at a different spot than yours is. You might have an easier time concentrating in meditation than they do. You never know. It's all different levels, like when we talked about the koshas. But the ego can hop in at any point there, and specifically paying attention to the mind. Paying attention to the manomaya kosha, the thought patterns that come up, particularly the ones that you see over and over and over. Things like self-deprecating thoughts, things that you feel like you're not good at, or labels that you put on yourself. I'm not good at fill in the blank, or I'm really good at fill in the blank. Just notice when your ego likes to do those kind of things. The practice that I put together for this class I think is really fun. It starts out with some aspects of pratyahara. Pratyahara means sense withdrawal. It's tuning out the outside world, the things that we get visually, the things that we can hear, taste, smell. We close off those senses so that we can have an internal focus. That creates a space where we can watch the ego and see what happens during our practice. And that's where we're going to do our breath work for this one. But then the practice itself is made up of some rather tricky balancing poses and very slow, controlled transitions. And most yogis are probably going to struggle with those. They are very slow movements that require a tremendous amount of stability at the joints. And that process of wobbling and being in that space of challenge makes all sorts of things rise up in our mind. When you fall out of a pose, when you have to come back up, all sorts of things happen internally. And that's what we're watching. We're watching that process. We're watching what the ego starts to say to us, what it tells us that we need to do, anything of that sort that comes up. But it's also a really nice physical challenge to train your body in a different way. Anything that's a little bit different and challenges us to practice out of our comfort zone is going to have that same process of bringing unusual things up for us to watch and observe. So I hope that you will join me for the practice to work on Asmita, and we will keep going through the Kleshas. We have a few more in the upcoming weeks. So thank you for joining me. Namaste.